Well, brothers and sisters in Jesus, it was around this time, almost 20 years ago, that I went home for Christmas for the first time. Now, some of you are college students, or you know college students, and so you kind of know what I'm talking about. I'd moved away from home when I was 19, home where I grew up in Edmonton, and I had moved to Michigan, where I attended college. And you have to know that for about 2 years leading up to that time that I moved away, all I could think about was moving away. Not that there's anything wrong with home, okay? Don't misread that. But I was excited to start college. And I was excited to be on my own, and to be independent. And so, especially as I was working between high school and college, I was working 60, 70 hours a week. And so every morning when I woke up and every night when I went to sleep, that's all I could think about was moving away, going and getting up, starting college. Finally, the day comes, I move away. About 6 weeks in, I started to have homesickness. Right? You start to think back and you miss the people you were connected to. You miss your family, you miss your friends. And so then I started to count down the days till December 18th. And the fact that I still remember the day almost 20 years later tells you that this was a big, big day. So count down the days. Finally, December 18th rolls around, and I fly home. Finally get there, and it was wonderful to be back home. Seeing people that you love, seeing family, seeing friends. And then about 3 or 4 days into that, I started to get homesick again. I started to think of my family or friends back in Michigan. By this time I was dating Amy, and so there's a little extra incentive there to want to come back home to Michigan. And I started to, get that restlessness all over again. And then I started to count down the days till January or December 30th when I could go home again. And I look back on that, and really, what happened? Well, home had changed for me. Now, you never really stopped calling your place where you grew up. Maybe you never stopped calling that home. But it wasn't home in the truest sense anymore. I'd put down roots in a new place. I'd developed a new sense of community in another place. I'd sort of start to become a part of a different community, different gathering of people. And so home had changed. And so my longing, if you will, for home shifted. It went from wanting Edmonton to wanting Michigan. Now, both of those are freezing cold in the winter, so some of you are wondering why you'd want either of them at Christmas time, but that's beside the point, I guess. That is a little picture, and I tell you that story because I think it gives us a little insight into what is Advent all about. Advent is this season. It's about 4 weeks that lead us up to Christmas Day. And Advent is a sense of longing for home, but it's realizing that as Christians, our home changes. A shift takes place inside. When you become a follower of Jesus Christ, you become a part of the family of God. Your home is no longer rooted in this world. Your deepest connections are no longer in this world and what this world wants and prizes and values. Your true home is now the home that God gives us in Christ. And so we have this sense of longing for and waiting for home, our true home, the home that Jesus brings us. That's what Advent is all about. In fact, that's really, I think you could say that's really a picture of what the whole Bible is about. The whole Bible is a story of God's people longing for home and waiting for home. And so what we're going to be doing this Advent season, this time leading up to Christmas, is starting to pay attention to those longings that we have for home. What is it that we're longing for? What is it that we're waiting for? What is it that Jesus brings us in the true home that we are created for? Now, the Bible starts off, and really you have to take about 5 giant steps back, and you have to actually find a way to look at the Bible as one whole book. In other words, if you could sit down in an easy chair at some point and read the Bible straight from Genesis chapter 1 all the way through Revelation chapter 22 in one long sitting, that would be a monumental task, and really probably impossible. But it would be a wonderful, if we could do that, because then you'd get a sense that the Bible holds together as one book. There's a cohesiveness to the Bible. You could argue that it's actually one long story. In fact, if you look at it this way, where does the Bible begin? We looked at a glimpse of that this morning in Genesis chapter 1. It begins in a garden, doesn't it? And in that garden, there's the tree of life. And if you read through all the way, you make it all the way to Revelation 22, where does the Bible end? Well, it doesn't end in a garden. It ends in a city. But that city, you get the sense, is really the same place that the garden was. The tree of life is still there, but what's different is this city has sprung up around the garden. In other words, the home is still there. You start in the home of the garden and you end in the home of the city. And all along the way, there's a lot of plot twists and a lot of turns, and there's a lot of brokenness and there's a lot of suffering. But the point is, we start off in our home, and then along the way, we're exiled until we end up back home again. Now, the thing of it is, of course, is that the Bible is our story, isn't it? Look at it this way. The Bible starts in Genesis in years past, and it ends in eternity, forward. We're somewhere right between Jude and Revelation, you might say. We're kind of in that last slice before eternity begins. And so the Bible is really our story. And what that means is that you and I are people on this journey. We're meant to see ourselves as people on this journey home, to our true home. And just like the story of the Bible is a story of twists and turns of people who are exiled, we too share that longing. Let me just explain to you what I mean by that. You follow through the Bible and you see that home is always just out of reach. I mean, Adam and Eve, they start off in the garden, and then they're exiled. They're put out of the garden. They're put out of their home. And then you fast forward a little bit, and we'll spend a little more time on this next week, but you get to the Israelites in Egypt. And they're enslaved, and they're promised this better home. They're promised a place that God will give them. And they wander through the desert for 40 years, and they can almost see home just on the horizon. It's just right over the horizon there. They're practically there, but they're not there yet. Right? Home is just out of reach. And then finally they settle down in the land, and they take possession of it, but it's like they don't last long in the land. It's like they never really develop roots that last forever. Because of a lot of problems among the people, they are actually eventually exiled out of the land. They lose their home again. And then they spend years in exile. And what are they doing while they're in exile? They're thinking about home. They're wanting to go home again. Right? And it's a little like you take a car trip and your kids ask you every 5 miles or 5 feet, are we there yet? Of course, you have to keep telling them, no, stop asking, we're not there yet. That's our journey. In fact, to put this a little bit differently, we look around in this world and there is so much pain, there's so much suffering, there's so much brokenness, right? The headlines every day tell us about one new thing, one more example, one more story of the reality of pain and suffering in our world today. And actually that's maybe good for us in the sense that it awakens our longing. It ought to stir in us a longing for home. A longing for a place that's free of those things. Maybe that's what Advent is meant to help us do. It's to focus, in that sense, to focus on the destination. It's to say that this world isn't really home. There's something better that awaits. Yes, Advent's about waiting for Christmas, but more specifically, it's about waiting for our true home. But as we wait, we don't just sit around and do nothing. We're actually meant to taste the realities of the future today. Christians are not called to sit around and start thinking about heaven so much that they forget their place in this world. We're actually called as God's people to create and to give the world little tastes, little glimpses of what home actually looks like. And that's what we're going to look at this season. What does it look like to go home? To wait for home? Even to experience a little bit of home today. Now, I've been dancing around it all this time, and you're wondering to yourself, well, what do you mean when you talk about home? Well, home in part is where your roots are. It's where you're connected. But it's bigger than that, isn't it? I mean, home is that place where we are meant to be. It's living the way we were meant to live. It's living with the way that God designed it for us to live. And that's why the Garden of Eden is such an important story for us. That's why Genesis 2 is such a key text, because it gives us a glimpse of what we were made for, how we were made. In other words, it gives us a glimpse of what home is meant to look like. Now, I want to show you really just two things. And again, flying at 38,000 feet, we're missing a lot of detail that I wish we could spend time on. There's so much here. This is such a rich passage. But we'll have to really suffice with two key ideas here that give us a glimpse of what home is. The first, created for a purpose, and the second, created for relationship. If you have your Bible still open, look with me here. I just want to show you one verse, well, two verses to start with. Verses 18 and 19, God says, it's not good for man to be alone, so I'll make a helper suitable for him. Then we get into verse 19 that says, God brings all the creatures to Adam to see what he would name them. Now, I don't know what you thought of when you read that. I don't know what you picture, but it almost sounds like Adam is the first taxonomist, right? Like, the guy that has to name and categorize all the species and, I don't know, kingdom, class, phylum, species, genus. I probably got that all mixed up, but you get the idea, right? That's what his job was. But yes, that was it. I mean, we read that he names the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and so on. But to name something is to exercise authority over it. It's said that John F. Kennedy, the president, had this way of nicknaming people. So the story goes that he was introduced to a woman one time named Ingrid. And, so she comes in, nice to meet you, Mr. President. And he says, good to meet you too, Inga Binga. Now, if your name was Ingrid and you met the president, I don't know how you'd respond to that. But I have a feeling you wouldn't correct him on that. Now, if your name was Ingrid and you came to me and you introduced yourself and I said, hello, Inga Binga, I have a feeling you would correct me on that. You'd say, don't ever call me that again. But the president is a little different in the sense that he has this position of authority. Now, right or wrong, that's the right way or wrong way to use it. We can discuss that. But the point is, he exercised authority. If you name something or if you name someone, you're claiming a right of authority over that person or that object. And in a sense, that's what Adam was really doing. That's what his work of naming creation was. It was his response to God's commandment to fill the earth and to subdue it, to take care of it and to exercise dominion over it. And by naming the creatures, Adam is claiming that right that God had given him. He's claiming authority to do what God had called him to do. Now, the text tells us that Adam is alone and there's no suitable helper. So in the process of fulfilling this task of naming and exercising authority over creation, it also comes to light that Adam has no counterpart. And all the owls had other owls, all the dolphins had other dolphins, all the fish had other fish, and so on, but there's nothing for Adam. He's alone. And the first time it's said that something isn't quite yet right about creation. And so God creates a helper. Now, some of us might read that and you might say, well, look, this proves, man is superior, man has to do the work, and isn't it nice that God creates an assistant? And let me right away say that's not what the text means. And I'll show you and I'll tell you why. Some of you are glaring at me. I'm going to, just a minute now, give me a second here. Other places in the Bible, it is said that, the psalmist, for example, God is my, what? My helper. You would never say that the psalmist says he's superior and isn't it nice that God's his little assistant. You'd never say that. You might say the psalmist couldn't do what God wanted him to do until God came and empowered him and helped him to do that. That's the sense in which this is meant here. In other words, the man, Adam, couldn't do the work God had called him to do. He couldn't do it alone. The woman couldn't do it alone, but together they are called to fulfill this purpose that God had called them to. Together they're called to exercise authority and dominion over creation. Now, what does all of this have to do with you? Let me put it really simply. You were created for a purpose. You were created for a purpose. And if you have never discovered what that purpose is, you're always going to feel restless. You're always going to wonder if your life has really any meaning. Genesis chapters 1 and 2 tell us that God makes us with the purpose. Together as human beings, we exercise care and dominion over God's creation. We draw out the potential in the creation. We expand on what God has done. We cultivate creation. We design, we create, we paint, we engineer, we construct, we build, we write music, and so on. And that's a way of exercising authority over what God has made. So let's take an example that you might sort of wonder about. Let's say you flip burgers. It's not a glamorous job, but arguably it's kind of an important one. You flip burgers, and if you just do it to earn a paycheck, to punch in, to punch out, guess how much care you're going to have for the work that you do. On the other hand, if you see it as a task of cultivating the raw material in creation, no matter how small that may be or how insignificant it may seem, but if you see that it's a way to cultivate creation, to meet the physical needs of other people, and maybe to create a sense of community as people come in and enjoy eating burgers together, your work takes on a deeper meaning. If you're a teacher, if you just say, okay, I got to earn money so that I can eat at night, your work is going to have very little sense of overall purpose. But if you see it as a work of shaping the hearts and minds of students to the glory of God, your work takes on much bigger significance. If you're an artist and all you're doing is trying to create something so you have something to hang in a gallery somewhere, you're not going to be all that driven or motivated. But if you see it as the work of cultivating creation and reflecting the beauty of God, your work takes on much more significance. You can go on and on. The point is we were created for purpose, to exercise authority in this world. And until you find that purpose, life seems meaningless, it seems unimportant, your work will drive you nuts. Now, second thing, created for a purpose, but created also for relationship. Verse 25 is important. Look with me for a moment. And I'll tell you why it's important, for a lot of reasons, but here's one of them. It's the last verse in the Bible before sin enters the world. It's the climactic verse, final verse before anything goes wrong with creation. And so it tells us something key about what creation was like, what home was like, what relationship was like. Naked and unashamed. Now look, I realize when you're about 8, this verse makes you giggle out loud. Because you're thinking, look, they haven't made Levi's yet. And they're running around there naked. But that's not the point, actually. That's not the main emphasis in this text. What this really is about, what we are reading here is a description of vulnerability and intimacy. See, Adam and Eve have the opportunity here to enjoy this relationship where they are fully known and where they know each other fully, down to the very core of their being, in the most intimate, the most personal way. And God is showing us what relationship is meant to look like. Now, verse 24 tells us that, and this is, a lot of scholars think that verse 24 is Moses, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but Moses interpreting what this actually means. And then he puts in the comment about marriage. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united, and they will become one flesh. In other words, to put this simply, what God is intending here is a context. Marriage is a context in which this vulnerability is possible. Now, the other part of it, of course, is that they are without shame, which means that yes, they are vulnerable, yes, they're transparent, they're known, they're being known, but there's no fear of rejection. They can be fully known and fully loved. There's no fear of sharing oneself with the other and having that other person turn on you or reject you or scoff at you or laugh at you. Fully known, fully loved. And in the context of marriage, if you're a married person this morning, or if you hope to be married, or if you intend to be married, this gives you a picture of what marriage is meant to look like. Fully known, fully loved. Mentally, emotionally, spiritually, sexually, physically. Every aspect of your being shared with another person, fully transparent, fully loved. Now, if you're not a married person, you need to understand this verse applies to us as well, because this verse doesn't just tell us about marriage, although it says that marriage is the context where this is reserved for the most intimate and personal knowledge, but it also tells us that we're all meant for relationship. Right? It's not good for man to be alone. It doesn't say it's not good for man to be unmarried. put this a little differently, we all need relationship in our life. We all need relationship where we can share ourselves with another person. Now again, marriage is the context where the sexual aspect of that is to be shared, but we do need relationships. We need friendships. We need community where we can share struggles and hopes and fears and joys with another person. Right? That's what we're created for. That's the home. That's the aspect of home that God made us for. Now, if you're really, really honest, and if you look around at the world, and you look around at our culture, you see that this is both very, very rare, I think, and very, very frightening. In fact, look at chapter 3, verse 7 now. Here's the first verse after the fall. The first verse after sin enters the world, and what happens? They both realized that they were naked, and so they made fig leaves and they hid themselves. They covered themselves. Think about that for a moment. Last verse before sin enters into the world, the goodness of knowing and being known. The first realization after sin enters the world, that intimacy, that vulnerability is severely damaged. It's damaged enough that it's almost unbearable now. So they have to cover themselves. To put this a little bit differently for us today, do you realize how fearful we can be of knowing and being known? You realize how we put coverings on? We hide ourselves. Even married people. We're afraid. We're afraid to be known. We're afraid to share our emotions. We don't want to look weak. We're afraid to share the deepest parts of ourselves. We don't want to be rejected. We're afraid to share even our opinions. So we don't want to be turned away. See, because of sin enters the world. And we'll come back to that in just a second, but all of a sudden to know and to be known, it's actually very, very frightening. It's fearful. And furthermore, this verse actually begins to explain the way that we've distorted and twisted around sexuality in our culture. I listened to a podcast a couple weeks back, and it was by it was not a Christian, it was a sociologist, and she did a very extensive study on what we call hookup culture. This was fascinating, very eye-opening. She says that what we've done on college campuses and what we've done in the broader culture is we've torn away sex from intimacy. And so people can have lots and lots of sex with lots and lots of people without ever sharing their soul with another person. And this was her comment. She said this. She says, I have lots and lots of students who had sex with lots of other people, but have never held someone's hand. Separating body from soul. See, distorting this intimacy. Totally twisted around, totally turned it all around. Why did it happen? Well, we jumped past it, but if you look, chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, a new character is introduced, the serpent. Now, we could spend weeks talking just about verses 1 through 6, but let me just give you this. What does the serpent do? He plants doubt in the minds of the man and the woman. What's the first sin that Adam and Eve commit? Most of us would kind of instinctively say, well, they ate the apple or the fruit or whatever it was. That would actually be like the second or the third sin. The first sin that they committed was that moment when they listened to the lie and the distortion of the serpent. And they bought into the idea, right? What is the serpent trying to do? He's trying to make Adam and Eve question God's goodness, His provision, His wisdom, His care. And so to do that, he twists around God's word, and Adam and Eve even begin to participate in it, right? The serpent says, did God really say you can't eat from this? And they say, yeah, we can't eat from it, and we can't touch it either. See that? They're buying into the idea. They're buying into the lie. They're twisting around God's plan and His purpose. And they begin to question God's goodness. And in doing that, they're actually beginning to say, we know better than God. We are wiser than God. We're a better authority. You might say what they're actually doing is they're setting up an alternative kingdom. They're setting up their own little empire. They're living in exile. They're turning their backs on the authority of God in favor of their own authority. And so in chapter 3, verse 23, when God actually puts them out of the garden, do you realize what's really happening there? God is really just saying, you've already started to live in exile. You've already turned on me. And so now you need to live outside of the garden. You need to be outside of my presence. See, Adam and Eve had already begun to live in exile in that moment. And that's why we experience the world the way that we do today. That's why it's so difficult for us to know and to be known, to be transparent, to be vulnerable. That's why we hide. What's the answer? What's the solution? Where's the hope in this story? Chapter 3, verse 15 is often read during the Christmas season. We didn't read it this morning, but look with me for a moment. Look at the second part. It's on the very top of page 6. This is God speaking now to Satan. God says, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. That verse is sometimes called the proto-evangelion. Fancy word, it just means the first gospel. Here's the first promise that God makes of renewal and restoration. Here's the first promise God makes to bring his people home again. How does he do that? Well, we already get a hint in this story. Again, we didn't read it, but if you look at the end of chapter 3, verse 21, God makes garments of skin. He clothes them. He realizes their inadequacy. They can't deal with this problem on their own, so God does it for them temporarily. God's already giving a promise. He's saying, I will clothe you. You can't do it on your own. I will do it. Fast forward centuries. You get into the Gospels, and do you realize how the Gospels sound so much like the story of Genesis? Take John's Gospel, for example. Do you know how John's Gospel begins? In the beginning. See, what John is trying to do is he's saying, God is starting over here. With the coming of Jesus, God is beginning a new garden. He's beginning a new creation that will be found in him. You look at Matthew chapter 4. And Matthew chapter 4 tells us the story of Jesus. Now, he's in the wilderness. This is like the devil's home territory, if you will. And who comes to Jesus? Once again, Satan comes, the tempter. And once again, the tempter tries to make Jesus question God's authority and his wisdom and his care and his love. But this time, the tempter is not successful. Jesus resists. He wins the battle over the tempter. And then take Mark's gospel. Near the end of Mark's gospel, Mark tells us a little detail of the story that's really odd. He says that someone was there in the garden with Jesus and he ran away naked. Now, why in the world is that in the text? Who cares? Well, what Mark is actually trying to do is he's saying this is really like the Garden of Eden again, and once again, someone ran and hid from the presence of God in fear. Except this time, there was one who stayed. There was one who didn't run from the presence of God. There was one who was hung up on the cross, naked and ashamed and vulnerable, known by God fully and rejected, not because of his own sin, but because of our sin. Our sin had been placed on Jesus. And Jesus is in that sense rejected. Why have you forsaken me? He cries. Now, why did he do that? He did that to clothe us in the righteousness and the perfection of Jesus. Let's get really practical here for a moment. When you know and believe in the core of your being that the God of the universe knows you down to the very depths of who you are, and yet he doesn't reject you, he doesn't turn you away, he doesn't exile you, but he loves you and he accepts you and he welcomes you into his family. Do you realize what that does for you? Do you realize the security that gives you? Do you realize the strength that gives you? You can be vulnerable with another person. You can take those steps of vulnerability because your security and your assurance doesn't come from them, but it comes from God. It comes from who you are in Christ. And when that becomes real to you, to the degree that we trust that, then we have that confidence. It's because of the gospel. Now, we're coming to the Lord's table this morning, and Lord's table, in a sense, is like it's like food for the journey. I mean, you've taken trips with your kids, or you've taken trips with your family. You remember trips when you were growing up, and they're asking you every 5 minutes, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And you're telling them, "No, stop asking." And at some point, you need to eat along the way. Now, when you're on the road, you usually, at least if you're like my family, we don't we don't usually go in for a nice big meal along the way. Something like McDonald's. It's something